Good evening or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome on behalf of all of the Peerage partners, colleagues, family, and friends, and Dan Senor and all of his colleagues and the Elliott management people. It's really an honor and a privilege to have the opportunity to spend some time in conversation with Dan Senor. I've had the privilege of knowing Dan for about 20 years, although we haven't interacted extensively. Dan has more friends in Toronto and in Canada than any Canadian I know. And although he doesn't reside here, he is known as one of the great friends of Toronto and Canada, in addition to one of the great brand evangelists for Israel, the Jewish people, and one of the great thought leaders globally. So Dan, it's really a wonderful opportunity to interact with you, and I'm looking forward to the next hour.
Miles, thanks so much. You have been a friend for a while, and you have been a champion for a range of projects I've been involved with and causes I care a lot about, as you mentioned, not the least of which is Israel. And so I'm thrilled to have this conversation, and I look forward to getting into it.
So look, let's go back to the beginning. You were born in 1971. You were born in Utica, New York, and then you made Aliyah to Toronto.
Yeah, to Toronto.
So tell me about why Utica and how did you get to Toronto?
My father, who had worked for a number of years in professional Jewish life, and he was a protege of Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver. My father grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. He was a protege of Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver, who was a prominent rabbi in the Cleveland area, and was really one of the early champions in the American Jewish establishment, advocating for American recognition of Israel's independence during the founding of the state. My father was a young man working, mentored by Abba Hillel Silver, and that began my father's engagement, if you will, in pro-Israel activism, Jewish community life. And he had held a number of positions teaching and being involved with Jewish community life, but he also worked in American politics. And he worked for the mayor of Utica, New York. So he was teaching at Syracuse University and working for the mayor of Utica, New York, Mayor Osaro. Mayor Osaro lost his re-election campaign, and no one thought he was going to lose his re-election campaign. He lost his re-election campaign. And my father got a job selling Israel bonds in Canada. He was offered that job. So he said, all right, so we'll move to Canada. And so he picked up me and my sister and my mother, and we moved to Toronto. And I was a young boy. We kept our U.S. citizenship. We retained our U.S. citizenships because it was assumed that we would move back to the U.S. at some point. He wasn't going to be there long. And then he went from working for Israel Bonds, and then he got recruited to work for the Weizmann Institute of Science in their Canada office. So he ran the Canadian operations for the Weizmann Institute of Science. A number of pillars of the Canadian Jewish community philanthropically were behind funding a major project that my father helped conceive of, which is a solar energy program at the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot, which was really a Canadian project. And my father passed away just as before they were digging ground on the project. He passed away prematurely in 1984. My mother, who had been on the run for a big chunk of her life, she's a Holocaust survivor, she decided that we would just stay put in Toronto. She didn't want to move again after my father passed. And so we stayed in Canada until I was about 19 years old. Or I stayed in Canada until I was about 19 years old. And had a wonderful upbringing there. As you said, I've got a lot of friends there. I've got a lot of reason to go back. In fact, I'll be coming to Canada in the fall for a speaking engagement. And I got to tell you, Miles, I feel, and we may get into this, but I feel my upbringing in Canada was a big part of who I am. And maybe because of that, even though my mother no longer lives there, she now lives in Israel. My siblings don't live there. I have less reason to visit on a regular basis, on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm very worried about Canada, and I'm very worried about Canadian Jewish life, and specifically Toronto Jewish life, in this post-October 7th environment. But I have incredibly fond memories, great relationships, and it's, like I said, it's a big part of who I am.
So you went to University of Western Ontario?
Yeah, I was there for 2 years. And had a great experience there, and then did my third year at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And so I moved to Israel for a year after 2 years at Western.
And what did you study at Hebrew University?
I studied history in both places. My focus at the Hebrew University was mostly focused on U.S.-Israel relations, the history of U.S.-Israel relations, the history of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East.
And then you went to Harvard and did an MBA there.
Yeah, when I finished at Hebrew U, I went back to North America, and I wanted to work in American politics. During my summers, even living in Canada, as I was finishing high school and while I was in university, I interned in Washington. So I was always very interested in American politics. And when I finished my BA, I wanted to work in American politics. So I worked on a U.S. Senate campaign in Michigan for a year in the 1994 election cycle. And the guy I was working for is a guy named Spence Abraham. He got elected to the Senate. I went with him to Washington, where I worked with him in the U.S. Senate as an advisor for a few years, and had this itch to, at some point, transition to the business world. I knew that I had this sense that I always wanted to kind of bounce between business and public service, that's kind of, I didn't know exactly how it would work out, but I just had a sense that that's how I would live my life. And so I figured I had been working in politics and government for a number of years, and it would be good to get business experience, but the transition would be hard. So I figured an MBA was a good way to, kind of learn a new language, metaphorically speaking. And so I went and got my MBA, and then I came out of my MBA, and I went to work for the Carlyle Group, the private equity firm in Washington. And then I took another detour from that back into government.
So you have a fascinating background. You spent a lot of time in the Middle East. Talk about that. How did you get to those various postings, and what did you learn from those experiences over the years?
Well, so Israel was a big part of my life growing up. I mentioned my father's commitments, my mother, as a survivor of the Holocaust. Israel was a big part of her life too. So we spent a lot of time in Israel when I was growing up. Even my father's work at the Weizmann Institute brought us to Rehovot. I remember spending part of a summer there. I have two half sisters, one of whom made Aliyah. My full sister also ultimately made Aliyah. My older sister lived on a kibbutz. I'd spend summers on her kibbutz. So I'd grown up very connected to Israel, and then chose to live there for a year when I was studying. In 2003, however, I was back in the Middle East, although in a different country, which is when, after 9/11, when the U.S. government, it was clear that the U.S. was going to be going to war, ultimately in Afghanistan and in Iraq. I had been approached with some folks I had worked with in the 1990s when I was working in Congress on Capitol Hill, who are now staffing the George W. Bush administration. And they talked to me about coming back into government, as it looked like the U.S., as I said, was gearing up for these wars, to play a role at kind of the intersection of the Defense Department, the White House, and communications and policy in a civilian role in the Middle East. So working for the Pentagon and the White House, but to be based in the Middle East. And I agreed to do it. I thought I would just take a leave from the Carlyle Group and just do it for 90 days. It ended up being much longer. And the thinking was that the Pentagon would deploy me to Doha, to Qatar, where there's a large base there at Camp Asaliya. Camp Asaliya is the base right next to the Al Udeid Air Force Base, which is where the U.S. Air Base in Doha is. And Doha is what they call Central Command Forward. So the way the U.S. military is organized is through these different commands. And there's a U.S. command for Europe. There's a U.S. command for South America. There's a U.S. command for the Pacific, and there's a U.S. command basically for most of the Middle East, part of North Africa. And that command is called Central Command. Now, the headquarters for Central Command is in Tampa, Florida, at the MacDill Air Force Base. But they also have what's called a forward operating base, which is when the U.S. is at war, you also have to have a command base that's in the theater of operations. And the command base for the war in Iraq was in Doha at Al Udeid Air Base at Camp Asaliya, which they called Central Command Forward. And the idea was that I would be deployed to Central Command Forward in a civilian role. General Tommy Franks was the commander of that war, and I was assigned to work with him and some of his other leadership team working on policy and communications issues on behalf of the White House and the Pentagon. I was in that role, supposed to be 90 days, as I said. The war kind of moved in a more accelerated pace than initially expected. So I was soon then deployed to Kuwait and was based there to help launch the civilian reconstruction team that was going to go into Baghdad and work on the reconstruction of Iraq. And then I was asked to go, not just help them deploy, but to deploy with them. So I went to Baghdad from Kuwait City with the civilian reconstruction team. And,
What year is that? So
sorry?
what year is that? Just give us some.
2003. So this was April 2003. I moved from Kuwait to Baghdad on April 15th, if I'm exact, April 12th, April 15th, around there. I moved from Kuwait City to Baghdad. And then through a lot of twists and turns, I wound up becoming the chief spokesman in Baghdad for the U.S.-led coalition. So there's about 34 countries that were in the coalition, and it was all organized under the auspices of the U.S. military. The U.S. military had a civilian spokesman, or the U.S. Reconstruction Command, which was the military, and so basically Ambassador Brimmer, who was head of the political and civilian reconstruction, and the military was still fighting the insurgency there, and they worked jointly on the ground in Iraq, and they basically led this 34 nation coalition that was on the ground there in various forms. And we had a spokesman capability that was consisted of a civilian spokesman and a military spokesman. And I was the civilian spokesman, and I wound up having to do a daily press conference from Baghdad, actually twice daily, one for the local air press and then one for the Western press. And I started doing that in the spring of 2003, early summer 2003, and I was in that role until June of 2004. So I wound up all in basically living there for about 15 months.
And what was that experience like?
It was it's hard to summarize, Miles, because there were so many intense emotions and experiences and learning and at times life and death experiences it was one of it, like incredible highs and also incredible lows. I was present and had a front row seat to the first major American occupation, for better or for worse, of a foreign country. Since I guess to some degree the U.S. had a presence in the Balkans that was comparable. But other than that, you have to go all the way in the 90s, all the way. Otherwise, you have to go back to the post-World War II occupations of Germany and Japan to have anything comparable on this scale, where you had the U.S. government working with these other countries, effectively occupying a country of just under 30 million people, massive country, and so again, for better or for worse, I was sort of watching history unfold. Had a front row seat, tried to explain what we were doing to the press through a very difficult environment where everything that was planned for by our government, not everything, but a lot of things we planned for didn't go as planned. And we weren't properly resourced for it. So we had to be super improvisation on the ground in terms of how we tried to run things. It was a real education for me on the disconnect between U.S. government decision-making in Washington and the implementation of that policy on the ground. So the U.S. government and Congress and then the National Security Council was having all sorts of debates internally about how we should be doing things on the ground. And then there was the very practical reality that we had to do things on the ground. We had to run a country, right? We were counting the number of thousands of megawatts of electricity being generated in certain parts of the country in the middle of a excruciatingly hot summer in Iraq, and we're trying to figure out how to get electricity generated while our military people were trying to figure out how to fight off this insurgency and what to do with. I mean, I can go on and on and on. It was the most intense experience. I've been in and out of government for a long time. I've worked in politics. I've never experienced anything like this. I think it's impossible to try to replicate this kind of experience. So it was both very difficult, at times very frustrating, other times very rewarding. For all its flaws, the Iraq project, despite the human catastrophe, experienced the Iraq project has basically held. Iraq today, I have some concerns about Iraq today, particularly the influence to some degree it's come under, the influence from Iran that it has come under. But by and large, it's the only large Arab country in the Middle East that has had a consistent number of elections, where they have extremely high voter turnout, where they actually have a constitution that undergirds, decision making in the country. And this followed a regime that was in power for almost 3 decades. That was, like a Stalinist level fascistic regime that was one of the worst human rights violators. This is Hussein regime in modern history. So it's like an extraordinary transformation, and there's a lot that worked, but there's a lot that didn't work. And, that could be the subject of a whole conversation in terms of the implications for the United States, for U.S. foreign policy, for the U.S. leadership in the world, for the cost of what the cost was for the things that did not work. So and obviously on the human catastrophe side, I watched a lot of people who I worked with or had gotten to know either get killed or suffer enormous physical or mental wounds, including a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Chad Buring, who worked for me on my team, a military guy. And he was killed in October of 2003. And we were living in the Al Rashid Hotel, which was a former Saddam-run hotel that we had taken over in what was then the Green Zone. And in October of 2003, the hotel got bombed, the rocket attacks, and he was tragically killed. And I saw a lot of Iraqi political figures I'd worked with and gotten to know as we tried to develop Iraqi politics and a democratic Iraqi politics were killed. So I have incredible relationships from that time that I'm still in touch with, including people like Barham Saleh, who's currently the leadership president of Iraq, who's a Kurdish Iraqi, and I have plenty of others who I'm still close to. But I did watch a lot of suffering, and
Yes.
it's so that's what I mean. There's like a lot there.
Volatility. So 2009, you're 37 years of age. You write what is probably known today as the most important book ever written about the culture, entrepreneurial DNA about Israel. It's a must-read for every venture capital firm in the world. The Startup Nation. What was the initiative? First of all, it was a brilliant idea. People refer to it today basically not as a book, but as the culture of Israel, the Startup Nation, the entrepreneurial genius and uniqueness of Israel that allows it to have no resources, very little capital, in an impossible place in the world, yet develop brilliant technologies, brilliant new initiatives around medical breakthroughs, and unbelievable. I think Israel has more NASDAQ listed companies than any other country in the world. So go back to 2009. How'd you come up with this idea? What was the rationale behind it? And what's transpired since?
Look, the impetus for the book was the impulse for the book was that I had invested just out of personal interest in a number of startups in Israel and had gotten to know a number of Israeli entrepreneurs much more in the earlier, within the earlier cycle of Israel's high-tech boom. And when I was at Harvard Business School, I took a group of about 30 students to Israel on a trip during one of our breaks. And most of these students were not, well, certainly the overwhelming majority were not Jewish. And I don't think any of them had actually been to Israel before. And the purpose of the trip was to study the history and the politics and the culture of the country, but also because these were business students, to study the economy, the business, what kind of business environment, what kind of opportunities there were from a tech perspective. And at the end of the trip, these students were saying to me, okay, we get the how. Or so, let me say that differently. I'd say at the end of the trip, the students were saying we get the what. That's what they were saying. They're saying we get the what. The what was like more Israeli companies at the time listed on the NASDAQ than any country, more global venture capital, being attracted to Israel on a per capita basis than any country in the world, the highest density of startups in the world. I mean, I can go on and on. More, I'd say some of the major innovations happening in tech were happening. Some of the biggest innovations happening in tech that you never heard about, like the chip in the Intel chip that powered at the time most of our laptops. Was developed in Israel. There was all this stuff happening behind the scenes that people knew about, maybe faintly, but didn't know much about. And so these students were saying, look, we get the what, but we're interested in the how. And the how is, how did Israel pull this off in the least likely of places? I mean, that was what was so extraordinary, Miles, is that here was a country, smaller, about the size of the state of New Jersey, tiny population, like speck of a country, today close to 10 million people, but back then probably about 7.5, 8 million people. State of war since its founding. I mean, state of war, not actual war, but always like in a kind of war footing, surrounded by adversaries, at the time, no access to natural resources. And so at the end of the trip, the students were sort of less interested in the what. They kind of got the what. They were interested in the how. How did Israel pull this off? And I just assumed there was some kind of book that explained this. And I just assumed, okay, well, there's got to be a book, whether it's a popular written book or an academic book, and we'll kind of get the book and we'll circulate it. And I soon realized there was no book. And like I said, I'd gotten to know a lot of Israeli entrepreneurs, and they were some of the most impressive entrepreneurs. And I thought to myself, well, it'd be great if there were a book about them, and through their lens, we kind of explain how Israel pulled this off. And Saul Singer, who's my brother-in-law and is a close friend, and was a journalist in Israel at the time, my sister's husband, and he was working for the Jerusalem Post. I said, what if we wrote a book? I propose we do it together. We collaborate. What if we wrote a book that tries to explain how Israel pulled this off? And if we're successful, the book will do two things. One, there are many other countries that are trying to understand how they could build their own innovation ecosystem. So one, this book could be perhaps a playbook for how you build an innovation ecosystem. And two, the book could hopefully, give other companies around the world, governments, research institutions, NGOs, the idea that if they've got big innovation problems to solve, maybe there's a way to go do it in Israel. Maybe Israel wasn't on their radar for who they should cooperate with and who they should integrate with. And lastly, and this wasn't our stated purpose, but it certainly, and I can say it with you and with this audience, I saw it as an opportunity for us to describe another slice of life in Israel that most people didn't have exposure to. At the time, most people, when they thought of Israel, they thought of a place that was constantly at war, that had all these, struggles with settlements and debates about war and peace or lack of peace, and the Haredim and the Hamas and just think about and I thought, there's a whole other dynamic going on in Israel. It's the most important innovation ecosystem in the world after Silicon Valley. And no one knows that. And when you start climbing into that, you realize there's a lot else. There's the dynamism of Tel Aviv. There's the very liberal, small L liberal culture of Tel Aviv. There's the sort of creative innovation and dynamic of Tel Aviv and the surrounding areas. And it was a part of Israeli life that most people around the world, they had a very one-dimensional view of Israel. So for all those reasons, I thought we should write the book. Saul thought it was a good idea. I came up with the idea Startup Nation, and I liked the title Startup Nation. I never thought it would catch on the way it caught on. But the reason I liked it is because it was it's a double entendre, because Israel is a nation of startups, right? As I said, the highest density of startups in the world. And the whole founding of the state of Israel has a the modern state. I mean, there was Jewish history in the land, in the land of Israel, going back obviously to King David thousands of years ago. But and there's been some kind of Jewish presence in the land ever since then. But building a modern state, basically building a modern secular state, building a liberal democracy in the Middle East, that had all the accoutrements and all the infrastructure of an otherwise modern, liberal kind of European state, was a very
entrepreneurial idea. And you go back to Herzl, you go back to David Ben-Gurion. I mean, you go back and read their work, you would resonate. I'm sure, someone like you or some of the people on this call who are in the business world, because they had a very entrepreneurial mindset. And so I like the idea of Startup Nation because it's not only a nation of startups, but the whole founding of the state had a startup feel to it. And so we wrote the book. I had no expectations that it would be the success that it was, really none. My wife was convinced it would be a total dud, that it would be a failure. She thought we should still write it because we were passionate about it. But we should go into it eyes wide open that it could be, not of interest to anyone.
But aren't you shocked?
Sorry, go ahead.
Aren't you shocked 14 years later, it's as relevant and well-read and respected and talked about today as it was 14 years later as it was back then?
I'm shocked. Yeah, I am shocked by that. I'm less shocked now because obviously it's become normalized, I guess, in a weird way in my head. But I am when it really started to take on a life of its own, Miles, it was like an out-of-body experience. I was like, what is going on here? Like, it's translated into over 30 languages. It's bestseller in all these Portuguese, Chinese, I mean, almost every European language. I mean, you're just kind of watching all this play out, Korean, I mean, Japan. The weirdest thing for me is we started this organization. Now, some colleagues of mine, a few years after the book came out, and I started an organization called Startup Nation Central, which is an organization in Tel Aviv that was inspired by the book. And the purpose of the organization is to kind of be a GPS for anybody visiting Israel that wants to get dialed into the Israeli innovation ecosystem. Because after the book came out, all these people were showing up in the country saying, I read about Startup Nation. Where do I find the Startup Nation? Where's the address? There was no address. There's no one place to go. And so we wanted to create an organization that could channel all this energy into the innovation ecosystem, help companies and governments, as I said, and research institutions solve the problems they were wrestling with on the innovation side by partnering with Israelis. And so that was like almost a sequel, if you will, operationally to the book. And I would see all these people coming to Israel, and I'd be meeting with a lot of these delegations, and they'd all read the book and they all knew a lot about the book. And yeah, that was like an out of body experience.
So you're right.
To me now, it's like Israel is Startup Nation. Like, it's just sort of like, that's what it is,
Ben-Gurion had a great quote. He said, if you believe in order to be Jewish, you have to believe in miracles.
Right.
And
right.
Startup Nation book really summarizes the extraordinary accomplishments of Israel in spite of all of the lack of resources that you would expect that great entrepreneurial success stories would happen. So 14 years go by, you accomplish something that you and your wife really never thought, which is you'd write a world-recognized book. 14 years goes by, and you then say, I'm going to write a book with my brother-in-law called The Genius of Israel.
Yeah.
How did it come about, and what was the rationale behind that?
We had been encouraged by a number of people over the years, given the success of Startup Nation. We've been encouraged to write a sequel to Startup Nation, and we never felt, we didn't want to just, because so much, basically what happened is between kind of the 2015, say, and, the early 2020s, so much had happened in the Israeli innovation ecosystem to the point that what we wrote about in terms of Israel's successes were, kind of paled in comparison to what Israel had become. And I can talk about some of the changes, but so everyone's like, we need an update. I mean, so much more has happened. But Startup Nation wasn't just about telling people what was happening in Israel. It was explaining to people how it happened. Like, what was, as you said, Miles, like, what were the cultural underpinnings that, made about Israeli society that enabled Startup Nation to happen. And that obviously we're not going to write about again. All we'd be writing about is Israel was hot in these 5 sectors, and now they're hot in these 4 additional sectors. It would have just been like an update, not like a new story. However, what we were increasingly realizing as we stayed in touch with Israeli entrepreneurs is when we'd ask them why they thought they were so successful and why the Israeli innovation ecosystem was so successful, they would often point to something, this is years later, that we largely ignored in our book, in our original book, which was that it was like this, the health and strength of Israeli society, and the sense that they could take big risks, sometimes jaw-dropping risks, without fear of failure, because there was the sense that the country had their back, that they were part of something larger, a larger cause, and a larger community. And it was very comforting for them as they took big risks. They did, they'd often, they would say, "You're not alone. You don't feel alone here." And it was also the sense that you don't hear in other countries, that part of why they were building these enterprises and taking these risks is because with their success, they were putting Israel on the map. There was this incredible sense that like they took great pride in Israel being recognized for this medical solution, or this, navigational advance, or this, whatever it was, whatever the tech was. So there was this national spirit they had. So on the one hand, they had this commitment to individual excellence. They are ambitious individually. They wanted to become materially wealthy. So all the things you'd see anywhere else in the Western free world, but it was blended with this sense of national attachment, a sense that the country mattered to them, the broader national community mattered to them, and that kept coming up. And we were like, wow, well, this we didn't really focus on in the first book. Maybe this could be the focus of our next book. So we started down that path, and basically it was a study of Israeli society. And what was most shocking to us, you want to talk about being shocked? What was most shocking to us is when we went and started to do the research on this topic, not only did we see how healthy Israeli society was, but we happened to be doing this, Miles, at a time that the unhealthiness of Western, wealthy, affluent Western democracies were tragically all too apparent. And we would see like, well, wait a minute. So, most Western wealthy countries, US, Canada, UK, I mean, you can go on, are experiencing a crisis in deaths of despair. So staggering levels of deaths from alcohol abuse, substance abuse, suicide, epidemic of loneliness, demographic crisis, people having fewer and fewer children, to the point that most Western countries today, not just Western, are going to experience over the next several decades a dynamic where they're going to shrink and age. So most countries, including Canada, will become smaller countries, smaller populations, and aging populations. And those populations are the least hospitable to innovation, if you look historically. The pointy end of the spear today is Japan, where in Japan, which is a real aging and shrinking country, they have a real demographic crisis. I was in Japan a little over a year ago, and when I'd meet with government officials, I would say, what's the number one concern you have from a public policy standpoint? I was expecting them to say the growing tensions with China, and they'd say we're not making enough babies. The population's is shrinking.
Yep.
Schools are closing. We have just to give you one stat that we have in our book, which is jarring every time I hear it or say it, which is that in the last few years, the market in Japan for adult diapers is larger than the market for baby diapers. And
Wow.
when you look at that reality, then you look at Europe. Italy is not far behind Japan on this trend. The rest of Europe is not far behind Italy, and the U.S. is not far behind Europe. And this is where the world is heading. And I can go on and on and on. Mental health crises, teen mental health crises. The CDC in the U.S. has this, study that came out a year ago, March, about the record level of attempted teen suicide in the United States. So all of this was happening, and then we would compare the data to Israel, and the rest of the world was moving in one direction, and Israel is moving the other direction. Israel doesn't have a demographic crisis; it has a demographic boom. They're reproducing at way above the reproductive rate, the rate at which you need your fertility rate in order for the population to grow. And its population is young. It's a young and growing population. It doesn't have a loneliness crisis. It's non-existent. It doesn't have deaths of despair. I think it has more of a mental health crisis post October 7th, but that's from a legitimate war. It's not from other, ailments in the society. And it doesn't have a teen mental health crisis. And I can go on and on and on. And so we're like, wait a minute, something's going on here. We're basically, as free democratic countries in the West have gotten wealthier and wealthier, something rotten has happened in their society. Now, we didn't know if it was causation or correlation, but it was definitely there. And Israel was the only country to defy this. It was a country who had become a Western-oriented, democratic, free country that had become extraordinarily wealthy, largely through its tech boom. It's largely a free society, and yet it's non-economic society, all these things I'm talking about, all these metrics, was flourishing. So how did Israel defy all that? And it was like a puzzle for us. I mean, the books I like to read and write are books that are like, tell me something shocking and that doesn't make sense, and then try to understand how it is so. Those are like, so that's what Startup Nation was, right? How did Israel manage to build the second most important innovation economy in the world in the least likely of places? And our second book was, how is Israel the only country to have really defied this kind of societal tailspin, this downward spiral that most of the West is going through? And so we said, that's our book. And we
Mark,
went about writing it.
I want to pivot now and talk about Israel, Jewish life, Jewish communities, and the challenges we have. So before October the 7th,
Yeah.
you have concerns about what was going on around with the adversaries that Israel faced. Did you ever think that October 7th could have happened?
It's a great question. Look, a lot of what animated my my work on Israel outside of the tech scene was driven by my concern about the security risks, the growing security risks facing Israel. My primary concern was Iran, and Iran developing a nuclear weapons capability, combined with Iran's ability to arm and fund and train proxies around the region, and Iran's, growing ambition to have hegemon status in the Middle East. That is what worried me. I spent a lot of time thinking about it. I was an advisor in 2008 and 2012 to Mitt Romney when he was running for president. In 2012, on a trip to Israel with Romney when he was the nominee, the Republican nominee, I had given a background briefing to the press in which I took a lot of heat because I was quite forward-leaning. In retrospect, maybe not forward-leaning enough about the risk of the threat from Iran to Israel and what a Romney administration would do about it. And so I was deeply concerned about the threats to Israel. I thought the threats were real. I believe the threats against Israel had a genocidal dimension. They were designed to wipe Israel off the map, drive the Jews out of the Middle East. I didn't expect the first major front in that war to come in the way it did on October 7th. Now, what came on October 7th ultimately can be in some way directly or indirectly traced back to Iran. So my concerns about Iran, and I think other leaders in the U.S. and Israel's concerns about Iran were well placed. But the actual nature of the attack, of what we saw on October 7th, was, Miles, completely and utterly beyond my imagination.
So I have two questions for you. One is, why did the previous administrations, the Obama administration, why would they have funded to the tune of billions and billions and billions of dollars of aid to Iran, knowing that it was proven that they were trying to build nuclear capabilities? Israel had informed them. And the Trump administration came in and they said, we're going to stop the Iran nuclear pact. And now the current administration, the Biden administration, went back to helping the Iranian nuclear pact and funding additional billions of dollars, which we now know has been used toward the devastation in the Middle East. Even Americans are suffering as a result of it. What did we all miss? And what did the administrations miss? Because they're using all of these means that we gave them, that the Americans gave them, toward the annihilation of not only Israel, not only America, but Western civilization and democracy. How logically could we come to this place in society and history where they used our resources against us and nobody did anything about it? You were part of the administration historically, and you've studied this, and you're a brilliant guy. Why do you think we are where we are, and what do you think democracies will do around the world to fight this? Because I understand there's, I don't know, 10 tons of enriched uranium that was just delivered to Iran. They're gaining if they don't have the wherewithal right now, which I understand they might be close, they will shortly. How did this come about, and what happens from here?
So, look, the Obama administration had a theory of the case. The theory of the case was, and I will try to present it as in good faith as possible, even though I didn't agree with the theory of the case. But the theory of the case was that for the longest time, Iran had been treated like a pariah state. And as Iran got more and more isolated, it leaned into its pariah status. And if you look at the history of countries that are driven to that kind of isolation, they act out their worst instincts and are unsalvageable in terms of being a responsible member of the international community. Think North Korea. Okay. And they wanted to be able to focus their attention on Asia, and specifically China, which they thought would be the defining theater in the near to medium term future, and that being distracted by Middle East wars, Middle East tensions was for too long a focus of the United States, and the U.S. was neglecting the Asia, was not deploying the kind of foreign policy military capital that it maybe needed to play a bigger role in Asia. So they wanted this, what they call the quote unquote pivot to Asia. And in order to do all this, they needed to experiment with treating Iran as a more responsible member of the international community. And if they were almost treated as a more responsible member in a less hostile way, in a less adversarial way, Iran would reciprocate by behaving more responsibly and integrating more into the international community. This manifested itself primarily through a nuclear weapons agreement or nuclear agreement called the JCPOA, which was the Iran nuclear deal, which they argued put some limits on Iran's nuclear program for some time being, although not indefinitely. And during that time, Iran would be given all sorts of incentives like the ones you're describing to behave better. So maybe they would feel that they didn't have to rush to develop their nuclear program to be relevant. Not to rehash the whole history, but the reality is it didn't work. Iran did not seem to be well, on one hand, while they were in compliance of the nuclear arms agreement, it didn't mean that they were less ambitious about developing a nuclear program. They were both compliant. That was part of the problem with the deal, is that the deal, they could be in compliance and still develop their nuclear program over time. So it was hugely problematic. It depended on them having a change of heart. That's what it depended on. Them being compliant with the deal didn't mean no nuclear program. The only way you get no nuclear program is if they had a change of heart. And they didn't have a change of heart. And not only did they not have a change of heart, but the Iran nuclear deal did nothing to rein in or disincentivize Iran's support for proxies in the region who were doing real damage. So Iran could be in compliance with the nuclear deal while it was funding the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and that all transpired really until the Trump administration, really not like in the middle towards the end of the Trump administration, that the administration started to change U.S. policy. But by that time, a lot of damage had been done. And many of the officials today who were involved in birthing that foreign policy vision, many of those officials back then are back in office today in the Biden administration. So, it was a failed, foreign policy thesis. I don't know what else to say. The other thing I would say is I don't even think it's so much about the money and how much money and the billions of dollars, although none of that helped. Obviously, it was all problematic. The bigger issue, and it's something that I wrestle with now, and on my podcast, I'm actually thinking about spending some time on this topic, but it's not fully formed. The reality is we've tried everything with Iran over the last couple of decades in terms through multiple administrations, Republican administrations, Democratic administrations. We've tried different approaches, and none of them have really worked. And Iran is still moving full steam ahead in as I said, establishing its hegemonic status to be the most powerful country in the Middle East. And it's actually quite, if you kind of look at a report card, like other than I think they experienced a setback, which we can get into if you want to, on this little back and forth, not so little, with Israel they had 2 months ago. But other than that, they've been moving on at a pretty healthy clip, progressing along. And the only thing that hasn't been really tried is a full frontal assault against Iran to truly destabilize the regime, and certainly to neutralize its military capabilities, its offensive military capabilities. That has not been tried.
But Israel did discuss that prospect over the last 2 or 3 years. And the impression I got was the U.S. administrations were reluctant to give them the go-ahead but this is something that Israel had identified through their intelligence, that
Absolutely.
if they don't do that, they are going to move forward.
Absolutely. And I think they've been look, Israel's been arguing this for a while now. I mean, Israel's been basically arguing this since 2010, 2011. It's a big undertaking, obviously, to do this. Israel at least felt pre-October 7th, that they couldn't do it on their own, that the kind of military capability it would take would require either the U.S. doing it or Israel doing it in tandem with the U.S. But I just want to say, it sort of reminds me a little bit of the period before the Six-Day War in 1967. If you go back and look historically, it was obvious to Israel that the threats were growing. I mean, there's a different set of threats, obviously, mostly from the Arab countries, which aren't the threat to Israel today. But there was this sense that, it was just a matter of time before some version of the Six-Day War, they didn't know it would only last 6 days, but some version of that war would happen. And I do think Israeli decision makers are now recognizing more than ever that the clouds are forming, that they're going to face some kind of regional war at some point. Kind of the walls are closing in. Obviously, you got Hezbollah in the north, you have Hamas in the south, you have increased radicalization in the West Bank. You've got potentially, at best, weak regimes on Israel's border on the east. I think October 7th was a wake-up call that, like, well, what if this is one front, the Israelis are saying, this is one front we're fighting, but what if there are multiple fronts? And what if there are multiple fronts simultaneously? And what's that going to look like? And how do we get ahead of that? And how do we make sure that doesn't happen? And I think it's hard to answer that question without having a serious strategy about what you're going to do about Iran.
So I go to Israel a lot. I'm very involved philanthropically throughout the whole country, including with the IDF and including with Dovdevan, the Special Forces group.
Oh, yeah.
And I've been to many military bases, I've been to many Air Force bases. And my perspective, having come from many, many visits, was Israel's military capability was both omnipotent and omniscient. And they knew everything and they could handle anything. And they were a global powerhouse that nobody would mess with, because every time that happened, Israel was successful. Were you surprised that we got caught flat-footed?
Totally. Yeah, look, the Israeli leadership had a what they call the concepcia, which is like the concept. They had a concept. So when you're dealing with national security issues, you have to have capabilities, and then you have to have like a thesis, like a concept of what is actually going on. And so you have to have capabilities to try to, defend yourself if there's ever a war. You have to have capabilities to try to understand what the enemy is up to. So intelligence capabilities. And then you have to have form a thesis about what is the enemy's what are they actually trying to do? Now, obviously, in a perfect world, when your intelligence gathering is consistent, what you're learning from your intelligence gathering is and just generally what you're observing in the region is consistent with your kind of thesis, that's the best of all worlds, or that the former is informing the latter. Sometimes what happens is you are gathering information, and it doesn't exactly comport with your thesis. And then that's a real decision. Do you stick to the thesis? Do you say, well, wait a minute, I know the information feels like an aberration or what, but our thesis still holds. And here's, these are the number of reasons why. In the case of Israel, there was a pretty near consensus among all the political leadership, prime ministers, defense ministers, military commanders, intelligence leaders, leaders of the Shin Bet, across the board. There was a general thesis going back about, 10 to 15 years, that the leadership of Hamas, while a problem for Israel and while a nuisance, it was a problem that needed to be managed, that every couple of years there would be these flare-ups, these sort of skirmishes. Some would be longer than others. There was the one that lasted something like 14 days or 11 to 14 days. And in 2021, there was the one that lasted 50 days in 2014. So there'd be these flare-ups, but then they'd flare down, and Israel just kind of managed them. I guess there was always still the understanding, even with the flare-ups, that at no time would any of these flare-ups turn into a full-on offensive war by Hamas, because it wasn't in the leadership of Hamas's interest to wage that war. That, in fact, there are many in Hamas, in the leadership, that wanted to just run Gaza and govern Gaza and live in Gaza. And they didn't want to launch a war that could lead to turning Gaza into Stalingrad, where Gaza would just be completely decimated. And so they had this thesis, and the thesis was wrong, Miles. Hamas was developing and organizing for this full-on war that wasn't on the radar screen of the Israeli decision makers. Now, what we know a little bit of now, but we'll learn a lot more of, I think, whenever the war winds down and there's a formal commission of inquiry, which the Israelis do quite well after wars, particularly failed wars, like they did after the 2006 Lebanon War, like they did after the 1973 Yom Kippur War. They have these commissions of inquiry where they really, no country does it quite like the Israelis, but they really dig deep and try to understand what went wrong. So we'll learn more at that time. But right now, based on the streams we've gotten, that are sort of sometimes a little out of context, a little bit of a vacuum. The streams we've gotten so far is that there was intelligence coming in that Hamas was up to something, that they were organizing, they were training, there were signs. But whenever this information made its way to the senior levels said, yeah, but, and they would still hang on to their concepcia, their concept, that at the end of the day, this wasn't in Hamas's interest. And so getting to the gulf, I would just say, between those two is what the intelligence was showing and why the leadership stuck to its concepcia is going to be the big question, I think, in this commission of inquiry.
What do you believe that the division within Israel politically took their eye off the ball militarily. And that's also part of why we got caught flat-footed.
Do I think Israel took their eye off the ball militarily?
Yes. No, because of the political infighting.
I don't buy it. I mean, I think maybe there's some element of that, but I think the problems were, I mean, obviously, again, we'll have a better understanding for the cost of the basically 2023, which was the year of the big fight over judicial reform that really divided Israeli society. But I think there were bigger holes in the Israeli defense establishment that predate that. For instance, today there was a push for Israel to create many more army divisions than Israel currently has. They argue that there's 6, now people say Israel's short 6 divisions of the army. Whole numbers of tanks that should have been acquired. Israel never acquired. I mean, I can go on and on and on. So there's a bunch of structural decisions that were made that were predicated on Israel being in less of a hostile environment than it turns out it's in. And these decisions were not just about the flare-up in 2003. I mean, I guess the flare-up in 2003 wasn't helpful. Certainly, it was a distraction. But I think the structural problems are much larger than to have just been all kind of created in one year of political dysfunction.
Over hundreds, even thousands of years, Israel has lost the court of public opinion. We've always been in a position, and Jews have always been in a position of always being defensive. My daughter Sarah sent me a note that said, Israel's the only country in the world that has to defend itself for defending itself. My question, you're a professional communications person, like you're a policy advisor and a public affairs strategist for Elliott. I funded Frank Luntz. Frank Luntz is I was partners in his business, all about the rise of anti-Semitism on college campuses about 10 years ago. I never believed what we're experiencing today could be experienced. Why is it that the world has such empathy for everyone else other than Jews and Israelis? Why is it that there's no sensitivities toward Israel's right to defend itself? Because if it happened in America, if 1,200 men, women, children, babies, grandparents were murdered, raped, etc., there would be justifiable, disproportionate attacking. Israel goes out of its way to try and be precise, but all you see on CNN and all these other places is pictures of babies being murdered, which every single person, every Jew in the world says it's horrible and it's unfortunate, but we're doing it to try and bring back the captured civilians. And there seems to be very little sympathy toward that. Why is that? I mean, you're a communications expert. Why is it that we are not able to get through that we are justified to bring back hostages and take precise, strategic, defined military precision initiatives to do so, yet we're only bad guys? Israel's only bad. Why?
So I don't have a good answer to this question. And it's one I'm spending a lot of time thinking about, and it's one that I'm going to increasingly delve into in my podcast because I've been, as I said, spending a lot of time trying to understand it. I would say that there are two groups of people generally. In the interest of time, I'll just simplify it. I think there are two groups of people. There are those operating in good faith. I would say kind of good faith skeptics. They are people who don't wake up every day inherently hostile against Israel, but they certainly aren't born to be cheerleaders for Israel. But they understand that it's complicated. And I see a lot of these people because many of them populate newsrooms at major news organizations, and they're genuinely curious. And in my podcast, I hear from them all the time. They reach out to me quietly based on different episodes of my podcast. And in my podcast, I try to present Israel's dilemmas and challenges to the world. And that, it doesn't always mean Israel makes the right decision in every situation, as you would expect of any country. But I try to get people to understand what Israel's wrestling with and the trade-offs it's wrestling with. And I think there are a lot of people who operate in good faith in the media world who are engaging that content in a serious-minded way. And then, Miles, there are a lot of other people who I don't think are coming at it in good faith. And Israel is their new project, their new target of criticism. And if they were alive in a different century, they wouldn't have the easy target, if you will, of Israel as their target. It would just be the Jews. And in fact, Jews and anti-Semitism is something that there's a reason why they call it the oldest hatred. It goes back thousands of years. I mean, I often tell audiences, here's an experiment. Go into Google, type in the word anti-Semitism, and then type in any century. Pick your century: 20th century, 15th century, 10th century, 18th century. You'll be shocked what you see, and you realize this has been around forever. And you realize actually there's a rhythm to it, which is about every 80 to 100 years, it comes back in full force in some kind of major wave. I was just in Israel, as I mentioned to you, over Pesach. That was my third trip since October 7th. It was my wife's second trip. We were there with our kids. It was our kids' first trip since October 7th. And we went down to the Gaza envelope. We went to the kibbutzim in the south. We went to the Nova Music Festival south, the site. And I asked my 16-year-old son, last summer we went to Eastern Europe with my mother, who's, as I mentioned, is a survivor of the Holocaust. And we went with the extended family. We went to her hometown in Slovakia. We went to Auschwitz, where her father was killed. And I asked my son, so when we were in the Gaza envelope, I said, so what did you think of today? And my 16-year-old says, I know this sounds weird, but today was harder for me than going to visit Auschwitz. Because with Safta, with his grandmother, because at least that when I was at Auschwitz, I thought this was something that happened another time, like another period, another era, like it wouldn't happen again, that the world had somehow modernized, been enlightened, And he says, and then I go down to the south, to southern Israel, and I see the same thing again. And I think that is the reality of Jewish existence, is that there is this inexplicable thing where the Jews are the target of hate, basically sort of quietly simmering. And then there are these events where the vilification reaches this astonishing level, like we experienced after October 7th, where I naively, and I'm sure you thought, as you're basically saying, that the outrage of the world would be directed at those who massacred Jews. The outrage of the world would not be, so we thought, directed at Jews for objecting to being massacred. But that's exactly what happened. And in fact, that kind of vilification is what happens whenever you get these crazy rises in anti-Semitism about, as I said, every 80 or 100 years. And that's what we're experiencing now. And I don't have a good answer for why it happened now or 100 years ago or 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. It's not about good PR. It's not about good media strategy, but it's about something bigger and deeper. It doesn't mean that Israel shouldn't be more clever and strategic. And like I said, I'm going to spend more time on that in how it tells its story. But I sadly think for those who aren't operating in good faith, telling a better story isn't enough.
So America, over a long period of time, has been a great supporter of Israel. I believe genuinely, but also self-servingly, because Israel's the only reliable democracy in the Middle East, and it's very important. So Biden gives mixed signals, and their administration gives mixed signals. They do supply military capabilities and arms in an abundant way. On the other hand, they're very critical of Israel's behavior. Right now, I think in the north, this whole initiative is against the United States policy. The United States seems to want to try and negotiate a peace treaty, but as you know better than me, why is it in Hamas's best interest? They're thrilled with what's happening. They've won a lot of sympathy around the world. They have proven that their little resources, and with Iran's backing, they can do a lot of damage. Israel would love to have peace. They'd love to return the hostages, change the government of Hamas, and there could be peace. But what's the incentive? I guess two questions. how much of what the Biden administration communicates is just politics because there's a upcoming election versus that's how they genuinely feel? And would a change of administration change that? And the second thing is, do you realistically think that there's ever an opportunity for a lasting peace or even to get up? Do the hostages exist? Will they return the hostages, etc.? I don't see why this doesn't just keep perpetuating itself, because what's this, the third or fourth attempt to try and get a peace agreement where you had Qatar and you had Egypt and you had Syria and you had Saudi Arabia and the United States all involved, and Israel said fine, although I don't know how genuine they believe that what they wanted would be accomplished. So what happens, and where is America in all this?
There's a lot there. I think I think Israel has the best shot at weakening the resolve of Hamas when Hamas believes, and the Hamas leadership believes, that pressure is mounting on Hamas and not mounting on Israel. And unfortunately, in the first few months of the war, pressure was mounting on Hamas. Israel was full steam ahead in its military operations. The U.S., the Biden administration, had projected no daylight between Israel and the United States. The United States had deployed enormous military capabilities in the region, and also had been supplying Israel with all the resources Israel needed. And since then, in the last few months, you've seen the opposite. Israel, up until very recently, since it started to ramp back up in Rafah, had sort of taken its foot off the gas pedal on the military offensive, at least for some time. The U.S. government was very critical of Israel and putting enormous public pressure on Israel, to the point that the President of the United States talked about conditioning and suspending certain arms sales or arms transfers to Israel. And the UN was taking action against Israel. And, craziness on college campuses, which the leadership of Hamas sees, and in the international courts. And Hamas's leadership's calculation was pressure's mounting on Israel, not on Hamas. So why should we cut a deal now? And so the last hostage deal that was done, the major hostage deal, which is late November of 2023, was done while Hamas was under enormous military pressure. They needed a break. They needed like a brief suspension, which they got. And I think, and if you read the public communications that have been leaked out from Yahya Sinwar, it's like he thinks that they have Israel, quote unquote, right where they want him. So I'm skeptical that we will see any kind of deal with Hamas, and I'm skeptical to see a kind of short to medium term solution that leaves any independent Palestinian governance in charge of like a Palestinian sovereign state. I just think there up to now, at least, and that could change, there's no responsible leadership that has emerged. So it's not clear to me how Israel can outsource its security in Gaza to a Palestinian government that at best could be just cooperative but weak and could get rolled over in a heartbeat, much like Hamas rolled over the Palestinian Authority in 2005 and 2006 and drove them out of eventually drove them out of Gaza. So and I think after what Israelis experienced on October 7th and knowing what Hamas's agenda is, it's very difficult to expect Israelis to let their guard down and hand over major governing decision-making authority to a sovereign Palestinian state on its border.
In the United States, I'd heard recently that there was some rumor that the United States was going to take the leadership of trying to make a new peace deal, that they didn't want to deal with this coalition, that it was unsuccessful. Do you believe that's possible or probable?
You mean its own peace deal with who?
With Hamas? Do you think
I've heard that? I'm skeptical. I think it'd be extremely controversial, both from a policy standpoint and politically. I think it would be a disaster for Biden to do that.
So we could keep going, and this is fascinating. I want to know, you made a comment an hour and 10 minutes ago, and you talked about Toronto, the rise of anti-Semitism, your concern about Toronto. The good news is on Sunday, we had 50,000
It was amazing. I saw it.
walk with Israel, which is a quarter of the population in Toronto. Talk about your concern about the rise of anti-Semitism, the future of the Jewish communities in Toronto and Canada, for North America for that matter, and what you had on your mind when you mentioned that over an hour ago.
Look, I think that many societies, the U.S., but some countries are much worse off than even the U.S., and the U.S. is in a pretty bad place. And the two countries I think of are the U.K. and Canada, where anti-Semitism is just at a staggering level. It's completely brazen. Government officials largely not serious about doing anything about it. And I just don't. It's not clear to me where it ends. Like I don't see what ultimately is the obstacle to it worsening and worsening and worsening. So on the one hand, you see incredible solidarity among the Jewish community, and I saw the images from Sunday, and that was fantastic. On the other hand, you have, basically like pogroms or quasi-pogroms showing up, in Jewish neighborhoods in Toronto, and they're just sort of quietly tolerated. And I think that is not only bad for the Jews, it's bad for broader society. I think that the Jews are the canary in the coal mine, but once you tolerate that kind of disorder, you see societies begin to unravel. And I think the Jews never ends well for the Jews when you have order, a lack of order, and societal unraveling.
When Prime Minister Stephen Harper, was a conservative, was in power, Netanyahu told me that he was the greatest friend of Israel outside of Israel. And unfortunately, Trudeau couldn't be worse. He's voted, the Liberal government has voted against Israel at the United Nations every single time. I can't comprehend how you could be a Jewish person and vote Liberal in this country. I had no idea.
It's not my job to tell Canadians how to vote. I vote in the U.S., but organizing politically is a tool that Jews have wherever they live in the democratic world, and if they create no accountability, no electoral accountability with the power that they do have, however limited or however small, if they don't use it to subject officials to accountability, and there's only one way to do that. What are you doing?
Yeah. What's the last message that you'd like to leave the audience with that's important that we haven't covered?
I would say, Miles, that fighting anti-Semitism is definitely the crisis of our time in most of the democratic free world. But fighting anti-Semitism is not the only key to Jewish survival. And we must deal with this challenge, this horrendous challenge. But we also must, as part of that, continue to live and lead Jewish lives. That a thriving Jewish life, Jewish communal life, Jewish family life, Jewish rituals, Jewish literacy are as important to Jewish continuity as fighting anti-Semitism. What is so scary about this period, which if you study the history is so reminiscent of previous periods, it's about driving Jews underground. It's about making living Jewishly so uncomfortable, so unpleasant, that Jews are just like, what do I need this for? Like if you're a Jewish young person, you're in your teens, your 20s, you're like, it's so controversial. I want to go about my life. I want to go to university. I want to go do this. I want to do that. I don't want to like own all these fights that were my parents' fights or my grandparents' fights. What do I need this for? And so they gradually, wither their Jewish attachments and Jewish identity because it's too much trouble. And if the only thing we teach our young people, our children, our grandchildren, that Judaism is just a trouble and a fight and a controversy and a hassle, then you can't, in a sense, blame them for wanting to just like quietly disassociate. And so what I worry about is we also have to do the other stuff, which is Jewish ritual, Jewish joy, the beauty of of a Jewish life and a Jewish community and a Jewish family, and that sometimes you got to fight to protect that, but it's worth fighting for. And I worry that we're too focused right now on the fight. We should be focused on the fight, but it's coming totally at the expense of zero attention to what it means to maintain Jewish community and Jewish ritual. And so that would be my advice: is that the both have to be approached as almost like twin goals.
It's excellent advice. Friedrich Nietzsche said, "That which does not kill me makes me stronger." As I travel around the world and I talk to Jewish people, I think there's more solidarity amongst Jews now.
I agree with that.
I see more people, including myself, demonstrating my pride of association, being Jewish, whether it's Star of David or, bring them home, around my
Yep.
neck. But I think it's very important to reinforce what you said. I think it's great advice.
Right.
Dan, this has been fantastic, and I know that all of my partners, colleagues, family, and friends have really benefited from this. You're a remarkable human being. It's hard to comprehend how you can balance both being a global spokesperson, well-known author, communication strategist, in addition to your professional activities at Elliott Management. But I think you're a great example, which says if you want to get something done, give it to a busy person. And between you and your wife,
Takes one to know one.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, Miles. Thank you. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed the conversation.
Enjoy, everybody. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll look forward to our next conversation. Dan, thanks a lot, and we will speak to you soon.